This book was incredibly difficult to read. Its graphic and unflinching depictions of assault, both real and fictional, are haunting. Andrea Dworkin herself writes at the end of Pornography that she had a very hard time living while writing this book. And honestly, I had a hard time living while reading it. But that's the point. Pornography, men possessing women, is not just a critique, it's a call to action. Dworkin forces us to confront what is systemically happening to women, not as isolated crimes, but as a sustained form of gendered violence perpetrated by men against women. This systemic reality is obscured in the way media reports on violence. Headlines often erase perpetrators as if violence simply happens to women rather than being committed by men. For example, a BBC headline reads, "Violence against girls and women rises in London," but this phrasing makes it seem as if violence is an autonomous force, not the result of male actions. A more honest headline would be, "Male violence against women and girls rises in London." This book primarily focuses on the power of men in the porn industry, how they are the orchestrators of power in society as well as in sexual relationships. In patriarchy, even lesbians, women who exclusively sleep with other women, are for male consumption. Women can never be free agents of their own identities with their own autonomous desires while living under male supremacy. Dworkin ominously reminds us that women can also be actors on the behalf of oppressors. She writes, "Women can also use porn on other women," meaning that women, even when oppressed by male supremacy themselves, can be the most avid upholders of that same system. It is an attempt to distance themselves from the oppressed group, to transcend their womanness, as seen in Dworkin's other book titled Right Wing Women and Ariel Levy's Female Chauvinist Pigs. Women will often perpetrate some of the most misogynistic behaviours, for example, becoming a madame or pimp and going to strip clubs and so on. I will be analysing this book chapter by chapter, focusing on key points, but I want to remind you that it is important for you to also read this book, as points I highlight are my own subjective opinion. I will not be going into graphic examples that she uses, however, there are explicit themes throughout, and all the language here is used for educational purposes. Dworkin states that this book's main theme is about the power of men in pornography. Misogynists and upholders of male supremacy in America will try to hide behind the First Amendment. The First Amendment can be summarized as a part of the US Constitution that protects freedom of speech, religion, the press, assembly, and the right to petition the government. Porn focuses specifically on the freedom of speech part. Dworkin contests the efficacy of this amendment by pointing out that it protects only those who can exercise the right it protects, meaning that free speech isn't truly free or accessible to many groups of people. Instead, it favours those who already have a platform, power, and capital. In other words, if you are poor, marginalised, or silenced by systemic oppression, as many women are, the First Amendment's promise means very little, which results in a very limited ability to speak, be heard, or shape public discourse. Dworkin is correctly pointing out how the law and constitution appears neutral. However, in practice, it is still upholding the patriarchy and reinforces existing hierarchies. This is male privilege. Privilege is a crown invisible to those who have it and glaringly obvious to those who don't. Dworkin's last line in her preface is a powerful one. Men have a simple remedy for the state of things. They can alter their way of life. Dworkin took this quote from Christabel Pankhurst, who wrote this in 1913 about the trade in women. Sadly, things have not still changed today. This is a simple truth. If men want to end the systemic oppression, violence, and exploitation of women, they can by choosing to change. I would personally argue that this requires very little action from men, which is to stop watching porn and buying sex from women. It's actually a passive action that, if every man engaged with, society would see a radical change. This also points out that patriarchy isn't natural or inevitable, it's maintained by male behaviour and choices. That means that it can be dismantled the same way. It's painful for women to admit that the overthrowing of patriarchy has to come from the choices of our oppressors. Dworkin lists the aspects of power that help to maintain male supremacy. The first is the metaphysical assertion of the self, the I am, that expresses intrinsic authority. By this, she means that men have a deep internalized sense of being and value, and that they have authority simply by being. Nearly all men are allowed and are taught to assert their existence. The metaphysical self is an unshakable inner right to exist and act in the world without needing permission or validation. It is intrinsic, meaning it is not earned, given, or dependent on others. For women, however, this intrinsic authority is systemically denied under patriarchy. Her I am is not recognized as authority or autonomy. She is often treated as an object defined in relation to men, for example, as a daughter, wife, sex object, or possession, rather than a fully independent subject. In short, men's selfhood is assumed by power and meaning. Women's selfhood is denied, diminished, or made invisible. And that's just not social inequality, it's a deep metaphysical violence. The second aspect of power is the use of physical strength, used over and against others less strong and without the sanction to use strength as power. By this, she means that power often shows up as raw physical dominance, the ability to control, harm, or intimidate others, especially those who are weaker or not socially allowed to use violence themselves. In simpler terms, men have more physical strength and the social permission to use it, and often assert dominance over women and other men with less power. Women, even if physically strong, are not sanctioned by society to use violence or force as a means of power. So men are not only physically stronger on average, but also culturally authorized to use that strength through things like war, policing, domestic violence, and social coercion. Another facet of this is that physical incapacity is a form of feminine beauty and a symbol of male wealth. He is rich enough to keep her unable to labor, useless, ornamental. Dworkin is showing how women's enforced weakness has been turned into a cultural ideal, not for their benefit, but to signal men's wealth and dominance. In today's world, we see Dworkin's point everywhere. Men aren't just stronger on average, they're given the right to use that strength, whether it's in the home, on the streets, or in institutions like the police or military. Society licenses men's physical dominance. Women, even when strong, are expected to stay passive, non threatening, and vulnerable. This isn't just about individual behaviour, it's about a system that defines who is allowed to exercise power and who must submit to it. The third power is the capacity to terrorize, to use self and strength to spread fear, fear in a whole class of people. Dworkin is saying that true power is not just in the ability to hurt someone, but the ability to make an entire group live in fear of being hurt. Men as a class use their social and physical power and threat of violence to instill fear in women as a class. This fear isn't just personal, one man threatening one woman, it's social and structural. Women are trained to live in fear because male violence is so widespread and normalised that it keeps all women in a constant state of caution and vulnerability, even if they are never individually attacked. The power to terrorize is the power to control behaviour without even acting, because fear alone disciplines and limits what women feel free to do. The fourth power is that men have the power to name. This idea is rooted in the feminist critique of how language shapes reality. Dworkin suggests that men, as a dominant group in a patriarchal society, define the terms by which women exist, how they are perceived, categorized, and valued. This extends to the way men name and define sex, sexuality, and women's roles, often in ways that reinforce male supremacy and female subjugation. In this context of pornography, it means that men control how women's bodies and sexuality are represented. Through pornographic imagery and language, men construct a reality where female degradation is normalized, eroticized, and even seen as natural. Women's voices and experiences are overwritten by male defined narratives of sex and power. By stating that men have the power to name, Dworkin highlights how this linguistic and conceptual power upholds systemic systems of oppression. She argues that for women to achieve the true liberation they deserve, they must first challenge and reclaim the power of naming, asserting their own definitions of self, sexuality, and reality. Fifth, men have the power of owning. Male power is rooted not just in strength or fear, but in deep systemic belief that men have the right to possess women as property. Ownership here isn't just about property in the legal sense, although that's a part of it. It's also a mindset and a social system where men see women's bodies, labour, sexuality, and even reproductive power as something they can possess, control, and use. Women are treated not as full human beings with autonomy, but as objects or resources for male benefit, similarly to how one might own a house, a farm, or a herd of animals. Owning also symbolizes absolute authority and access. If you own something, you have the right to decide what happens to it, without needing its consent. Dworkin is exposing how this ownership mentality underpins sexual violence, marriage traditions, economic inequalities, and even everyday interactions between men and women. Sixth, the power of money is distinctly male power. Dworkin is saying here that in patriarchy, money isn't neutral, it's another extension of male power, used to control and exploit women. In a patriarchal society, economic control, having and using money, has historically belonged to men, and money itself becomes a tool of male dominance. It's not that just men happen to have more money, it's that the entire system of wealth and exchange is built to serve male interests. Men control industries, jobs, and resources. Men decide how money moves and who gets paid and what is valued. Women historically and even now are often economically dependent on men through marriage, prostitution, service labour, and so on. In this system, money becomes a weapon, a means for men to buy access to women's bodies, labour, and lives. Women who don't submit to this economic structure are often punished with poverty, social exclusion, or violence. The final point is that men have the power of sex. Dworkin is saying that sex under patriarchy is not mutual. It's a male-dominated institution where men have the power to define, control, and exploit sexual relations. Under patriarchy, sex is defined, controlled, and dominated by men, both in meaning and in practice. In other words, men control how sex is understood as something that is done to women, not with women. Men control who has access to sex, often through coercion, violence, money, or social pressure. Men control what sex looks like culturally, pornography, prostitution, media, shaping it around male desire and female submission. In this system, women's sexuality is not truly autonomous, it is treated as something for men to take, use, and define. Even consent is complicated when women are socialized to believe that saying yes is expected, necessary for survival, or the only way to gain approval or economic support. Male sexual power is the substance of nearly all cultures. It resonates everywhere. Across cultures, across history, male sexual access to women's bodies has been normalized, institutionalized, and celebrated. Male entitlement to sex, to control over women, shapes law, religion, art, language, family structures, and media. It is not just present in obvious violence like rape, it's embedded in everyday expectations about marriage, dating, beauty standards, romance, and how women are supposed to behave. Male sexual domination isn't just a side issue, it's central to how societies are built and how they function. It is the foundation of culture, woven into almost every institution and social norm. As Virginia Woolf wrote, she is his mirror. By diminishing her in his use of her, he becomes twice his size. To return to the main theme of her book, which is about male power within pornography, these strains of power are embodied in pornography's form and content. The degradation of women exists in porn to postulate, exercise, and celebrate male supremacy. Simone de Beauvoir describes the work of Marquis de Sade, often also describing pornography in general, as violent and self-obsessed. No perception of another being ever modifies its behavior or persuades it to abandon violence as a form of self-pleasuring. De Beauvoir is saying that patriarchal male behavior often refuses to recognize the humanity of others, using violence not out of necessity, but as a way to feed and affirm its own ego and pleasure. Male-dominated consciousness, specifically how, under patriarchy, men often relate to others, especially women, not as full human beings, but as objects to be used for their own gratification. In this line, she is making a few key points. Men's desires and actions are centered entirely on themselves, without real empathy or recognition for others as equal subjects. Even when confronted with another person's humanity, pain, or needs, this self-centered male consciousness does not change. It continues to pursue its own pleasure. Violence itself becomes a form of personal satisfaction. Hurting, dominating, or controlling others becomes pleasurable because it asserts that man's own sense of power and entitlement. De Beauvoir is showing how deeply embedded this dynamic is. It's not just that men are occasionally violent, it's that within patriarchy, violence is eroticized, turned into a means of affirming the self at the expense of others. In porn, Dworkin believes the camera and the photographer behind it also own the woman. The camera uses and keeps her. Pornography turns women into permanent possessions, owned not just by the men taking the photo, but by the whole system of male viewers who consume her image, meaning that the images produced in porn signifies the wealth and power of men as a class above women. The camera is the penile presence, which allows the male viewer to participate in the sexual action of the pornography created, which leaves no space for women, as even if there are no men in porn, women are still there for his pleasure, which is why lesbian porn is still made for men, as the camera is the stand-in for the man. Porn extends beyond the camera and the screen, making it difficult for women to exist outside of imposed sexual roles. Our identities become confined to the meanings imposed by male fantasies, denying us freedom to construct our own narratives. Virginia Woolf once wrote, "I detest the masculine point of view. I am bored of his heroism, virtue, and honour. I think the best these men can do is to not talk about themselves anymore." This is because men have claimed the human point of view. They author it, they own it. Men have made themselves into the centre of consciousness, which makes it difficult to think outside of this egotism. Feminists have discovered that the culture of males does not allow for our honest female participation. Dworkin writes, "The poet, the mystic, the prophet, the so-called sensitive man of any stripe, will still hear the wind whisper and the trees cry, but to him women will be mute," meaning that even the most sensitive, artistic men are conditioned to ignore women's voices, treating them as silent objects rather than full human beings. A man may cry over a sunset or find meaning in the rustling of trees, but he remains deaf to the suffering and realities of actual women. His emotional sensitivity does not disrupt his power or his blindness to women's oppression. When growing up, boys learn the importance of being a man, with the first and most poignant rule of masculinity being that whatever he is, women are not. Masculinity as a system is constructed by rejecting and devaluing anything associated with women. A man's identity under patriarchy isn't built positively by just being something, but negatively by not being like a woman. If men are seen as strong, then women must be weak. If men are seen as rational, then women must be emotional. If men are independent, women must be dependent. Masculinity requires the degradation of women to maintain its own superiority and separateness. This opposition isn't based on real qualities, it's a social rule that forces males to prove that they are not female and forces women to be framed as everything men supposedly are not. Men are groomed to develop strong loyalty to violence. It is a prime component to male identity, institutionalized in sports, the military, sexuality, history, mythology, religion, mass media, education, and so on. Some men will renounce the violence in theory, but practice it secretly against women and children. Some men become iconography of supreme masculinity by learning and mastering a violent skill, such as boxing, shooting, hockey, and policing. Some men will commit violence against the minds of others and some against the bodies of others. An aspect that seems contradictory is that in male culture, both the police and outlaws are heroic, meaning males who enforce standards are heroic, and so are the men who violate them. These two conflicting points are actually two sides of the same coin, which is that they both uphold male violence and supremacy. Conflict is action, and action means you have agency, and agency is masculine. While men and boys experience violence and abuse at the hands of men, there is a key difference in the way those same crimes are perceived against women and girls. The fact that crimes against women are ultimately viewed as expressions of male normalcy, while crimes against males are viewed as perversions of that same normalcy in patriarchy, society's general refusal to do anything meaningful to protect women and girls from male sexual aggression is testimony to the worthlessness of our lives. Female life only warrants protection when she belongs to a male, as a wife, daughter, mistress, or prostitute, as is the owner who has the right to have his females protected from another man. Youth, poverty, and race are intersections that make men vulnerable to violence from other men. These same intersections also compound the oppression faced by women. When focusing on men, we see that prison populations are overwhelmingly made up of poorer men, just as prostitution often draws from the same economically marginalized groups. Poverty is not just deprivation, it is a brutal daily violence. Racism compounds this, marking certain men as disposable targets. In the United States, prisons are overwhelmingly filled with black men. When these prisoners endure sexual violence, society's outrage collapses into silence, as if their suffering is owed, their degradation a punishment they deserve. which shows how men treat each other in the absence of women. They create a woman. Dworkin writes, women will be their surrogates, and every institution in the society will continue to demand that men do to women what men would find insufferable if done to themselves. Society assigns women the role of absorbing the abuse and degradation that men would never accept for themselves, and this injustice is embedded in all major institutions. Women are used as stand-ins for the pain, humiliation, and degradation that men want to avoid for themselves. Institutions like law, marriage, religion, media, pornography expect and normalize men, inflicting on women the kinds of abuse, control, and subjugation that no man would ever tolerate if it were directed at him. In other words, society is set up to offload cruelty onto women. Women are the ones who absorb the violence, the domination, the humiliation, so that men can feel powerful and protected from it themselves. Dworkin is highlighting that male supremacy requires women to serve as the acceptable target for things that would be seen as unbearable violations if men had to endure them. When women call attention to themselves as human, not objects, they are violating the male's most essential sense of masculine self. When women assert their full humanity, they threaten the male sense of power and masculinity, which is built on the belief that women exist as objects to serve men. Men's sense of masculinity is often built on the idea of control over women, over power, over dominance. Women asserting their humanity, their individuality, and their agency disrupts that power. It challenges the idea that women are merely objects to be used or owned by men. For men raised in a patriarchal culture, women being fully human, not objects for male pleasure, labour, or control, is threatening to their masculinity because it exposes the foundational inequality they benefit from. Essentially, the male identity is so tied up to dominating women that when women act as equals or assert their autonomy, it feels like a direct challenge to their power and sense of self. That is why women who demand equality or asserting their rights can be seen as violating the masculine status quo. Dworkin briefly explains that this accounts also for men hating trans women, as they violate this strict and enforced gender hierarchy and usurp male power and supremacy. One of the few points that I disagree with that Dworkin has written is that men pretend to call women powerful to distract from how powerless we are. I would argue that women are powerful, and it is this exact reason why men hate and push back against it so violently. If powerlessness were innate, not all institutions would have to uphold male supremacy. Porn is a holy corpus of men who would rather die than change. Dworkin is saying that pornography is revered by men as a fundamental, untouchable institution that upholds their power and masculinity, and that they would rather defend it, even if that means perpetuating harm, than change it. Using the term holy to underscore how pornography has become a sacred, untouchable institution in the minds of many men. It is not just entertainment or a product, it is seen as something that reaffirms male power and dominance over women. This idea is so ingrained that it is treated with reverence, as if questioning or criticizing it is sacrilegious. Men who consume and create pornography are so deeply entrenched in the patriarchal system it upholds that they would rather continue in this violent, oppressive practice than face the discomfort of change. They would rather keep the system of power and domination intact than challenge or question it. In short, pornography isn't just about individual men's desires, it's a systemic cultural force that perpetuates a particular vision of masculinity and femininity. The men involved in creating and consuming it have a deep attachment to it because it affirms their own power, and they are resistant to any change that would disrupt this order. Marquis de Sade was a French nobleman who was a writer and misogynistic libertine, who was imprisoned for sex crimes, pornography, and blasphemy. Historically, de Sade's sexual crimes have been underplayed by historians because of his literary status, aristocratic privilege, and the romanticization of his extreme sexuality over time. His actions were seen as part of a transgressive, artistic persona, and his social class, alongside the cultural fascination with taboo breaking, allowed his brutal crimes to be minimized or romanticized. His name, after all, is the reason that we have the term sadism. His ethic was the absolute right of men to rape and brutalize any quote-unquote object of desire at will. This resonates deeply with our male supremacist and porn-saturated society. At the age of 15, he was a military officer. He also began gambling and frequenting brothels at this age too. He took great pleasure in purchasing women, and most of the women that he abused in his lifetime were maids and prostitutes. Groups of people who we know are at the bottom of the societal hierarchy we live in, making them the most vulnerable. Dworkin writes, the leftists who champion him might do well to remember that pre-revolutionary France was filled with starving people. The feudal system was both cruel and crude. The rights of the aristocracy to the labour and bodies of the poor were unchallenged and not challengeable. The tyranny of class was absolute. The poor sold what they could, including themselves, to survive. Sade learned and upheld the ethic of his class. This quote suggests that de Sade's violent acts and sexual crimes were not merely the actions of an individual degenerate, but were influenced by a deeply unjust and exploitative system. The aristocracy in which de Sade was raised reinforced the idea that the poor existed to serve the elite, even through violence, abuse, and exploitation. This tyranny of class normalized the idea of using people as objects, and de Sade's actions reflected the warped systemic ethics of his time. In a woman-hating culture, it is particularly difficult to make credible the claim that crimes committed against women must matter. In a culture where women are seen as lesser or inferior, their suffering and victimization are often dismissed or minimized. This difficulty in making crimes against women matter stems from the belief that women are not worthy of protection or empathy to the same degree as men. In such a culture, women's pain and abuse are often trivialized or even justified, making it harder for their experiences to be recognized as legitimate and worthy of attention. It is important for women to learn that Sade is specifically writing for and to men, leading men to believe that he suffered because he did what you want to do. He was imprisoned as you might be imprisoned. The you is masculine. This reflects the dangerous entitlement that some men feel, which is to act without consequence, in a society that often aligns with masculine power, allowing men to act with impunity. Women, according to Sade and his ilk, can and should choose to experience the rape of women as men experience it, as pleasure, advocating for a perverse and dehumanizing view, suggesting that women should embrace rape as men do, transforming violence into pleasure, which reinforces male dominance and the objectification of women. He believed that all women are meant to be prostitutes, as he stated, women's sex never serves nature better than when it prostitutes itself to ours. That 'tis, in a word, to be fucked that you were born. Sade's quote reflects his deeply misogynistic philosophy where he views women solely as sexual instruments for men's pleasure, reducing their entire existence to fulfilling men's desires. By stating that women's bodies are inherently meant for prostitution, he denies women's autonomy, reducing them to mere sexual objects, and perpetuates a dehumanizing view of women as existing only to serve men's sexual needs. This perspective is part of Sade's broader rejection of morality and social norms, in which he justifies sexual violence and exploitation as a natural and inherent part of human existence. The final line of this chapter reads, in Sade, the authentic equation is revealed. The power of the pornographer is the power of the rapist/batterer, is the power of the man. Sade's work exposes the fundamental link between male power, violence, and control, where the pornographer, rapist, and abuser all exercise dominance over women in similar ways, reflecting the broader societal patriarchal structures that empower men to harm and objectify women. Dworkin rejects Sade's ideas that violence is an individual's choice or sexual liberation. Instead, she frames it as an institutionalized misogynistic act. With some defending Sade as a libertine, his version of freedom erases women's rights, reducing them to property. Porn is about power, control, and violence against women, not sex. It is fashionable to think that women have come a long way and are simply entirely removed from chattel status. However, in our current patriarchal society, this is simply not true. One need only look at pornography, marriage, rape statistics, and so on to be convinced that this is not true. In marriage, for example, in the UK, rape in marriage was only legally recognised in 1991. Today, a married woman is still obligated or obliged to have sex with her husband. He, not her, controls access to her body. Assault and battery of a wife is still commonplace and protected by the male supremacist system we live in. Womanhood, as we understand it, has been created within patriarchy. We are objects while men can be objective, precisely because they are not objects. To be objective means to know one's world, see it as it is, and to act on the objects in it appropriately. Women cannot be objective because objects do not see or know. A woman who resists becoming an object is by definition not a woman. In other words, within patriarchal terms, to be a true woman is to accept being an object, and resistance is treated as a kind of betrayal or defiance to womanhood itself. The myth that female beauty inspires pure male love is instead often concealing male domination and ownership of women. Scarcely any woman dares to ignore male ideals of ideal female beauty altogether, because these ideals will significantly determine the quality and limits of any woman's life. For instance, the cultural disgust towards female leg hair makes it almost seem like a toxin that women are expected to remove from their bodies. At the same time, if you do not remove your leg hair as a woman, you should expect weird looks from men and other women, because you are not conforming to the patriarchal beauty standard that is steeped in misogyny and paedophilia. While on the more extreme end, we have waist binding and plastic surgery. While some argue that it is a woman's choice, this argument lacks actual substance, as the beauty standards are created by men, which often require women to deform their natural bodies. We live in a society where beauty standards are often highly enforced. We are worried about being ugly, then we are worried about being rejected, and then we are worried about being alone. Another point is that if it were a choice, why do these choices always look the same? For example, breast augmentation is a cosmetic procedure that is nearly always to enlarge or lift. It is not considered cosmetic to reduce breast size. Also, rhinoplasty is always to shrink, never to enlarge. Why? Because these procedures conform to the beauty standards that have been set by white male supremacy. When women are their natural selves, men see this as a violation of nature. The prostitute is seen as the natural antithesis of men. Prostitution embodies the ultimate objectification of women. Men are defined by agency, autonomy, and subjectivity in a patriarchal system, whereas prostitutes are defined as consumable objects, stripped of agency and valued only for their sexual availability. In this dynamic, the prostitute becomes everything men are not supposed to be: passive, bought, used, making her into the symbolic opposite of male selfhood and power. She exists to serve and to be dominated, and to affirm the man's status as the active, desiring subject. Thus, the prostitute's role reinforces the gendered power hierarchy, making it clear who is acted and who is acted upon. Woman is not born, she is made. In the making, her humanity is destroyed. This quote draws from and sharpens Simone de Beauvoir's famous idea that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Dworkin takes it further. In the social construction of womanhood, a girl's humanity, her agency, subjectivity, and freedom is deliberately suppressed. She is shaped into an object, compliant, pleasing, passive, designed to meet male needs rather than fulfilling her own existence. This is the making process. The natural human potential of the female child is significantly and systemically destroyed so that she can fit the rigid, subservient model of woman demanded by patriarchy. In literary and cinematic pornography, she is taught to be that thing, raped, beaten, bound, used, until she recognizes her true nature and purpose and complies happily, greedily, begging for more. This means pornography trains women to accept violence and degradation as their natural role, ultimately teaching them to desire and embrace their own subjugation. Here, Dworkin is describing how pornography doesn't just depict violence against women, it actively teaches a narrative in which women's true identity is found in submission and suffering. Through repeated images of rape, beating, binding, and humiliation, pornography constructs a story where the woman, at first resistant, eventually comes to love her own degradation. She is shown learning that her highest fulfillment lies not in resisting abuse, but in craving it, begging for it, and defining herself through it. This narrative serves to justify and perpetuate male dominance, reinforcing the idea that violence against women is not just natural, but desired by women themselves. Rather than recounting the graphic and often disturbing anecdotes that Dworkin presents, I will extract and discuss the central insights and themes those stories reveal, respecting the emotional weight of the material while focusing on Dworkin's theoretical arguments, such as how pornography portrays women, defines sex, and normalizes violence. Sexual philosophers, like pornographers, need to believe that women's sexual sadism is more dangerous than men's. Therefore, men are justified in their social and sexual domination of women, and it can also be turned into male pleasure. Sexual domination in the male system is pleasure, while at the same time there is an essential illusion that women are not controlled by men but acting freely, turning it into an argument of what women privately want sexually just happens to be what men want them to do, which is one of the most pernicious and mean aspects of pornography. The willing suspension of disbelief is essential for pornography to function today. Without it, we would recognize that women on screen are constructed, wearing costumes, positioned under harsh lights, and contorted into uncomfortable poses as mere cogs in a much larger system. This multi-billion-dollar industry not only supports sex trafficking and broader violence against women, but it also employs high-priced lawyers to deny these truths. Meanwhile, men can relax. The porn created is proof that male control has fully eliminated any authentic female or queer sexuality. Pornography also documents rape, while stating that the weak people in pornography like it and want to be there. The weak are women as a class, economically, socially, and sexually degraded. In patriarchy, most rape that is coerced is not even considered rape. Often it requires women to be dead or beaten to a bloody mess in order to have the right to be considered a victim at all. Meanwhile, a liberal viewpoint assumes that women who want to resist can do so successfully, meaning that women who are in fact being mercilessly degraded bring it on themselves. Throughout this chapter, Dworkin refers to intersectional ideas, such as race, class, and age being factors that compound the issues faced by many women. White supremacy is a deeply intertwined force that upholds patriarchy, with both systems of oppression exploiting and objectifying marginalized bodies, particularly women of color. Within a racist society, white males feel that racial conflict in porn heightens arousal. This is because the more sexually dominated a group of people, the more sexual value it has for a white male supremacist. One of the main functions of porn is to highly sexualize the racial hatred towards a woman of color, which allows men, whatever their background, to experience sexual antagonism as pleasure. In porn, both the white supremacist and the camera are raping her. She is used by both of them, and she will seemingly beg for it. As many black feminists have pointed out, women nearly always means white women, so all women are saddled with the norms and values of white women while being perceived as deviant from the norm. White women are viewed as civilized, whose transcendent femininity is viewed through submission, which requires force, which in turn requires violence. Pain apparently is pleasure for the woman. Porn would have you believing that normal women need force and violence to feel pleasure. This is grooming all of us into believing that rape and battery are not violations of women's will. After all, men are the creators of most media and therefore truth, and pornographers are telling us the truth about women and their sexuality. To state otherwise is not just wrong, it's bigoted. Men of intelligence and cultural achievement have always woven porn into their work, be it art, religion, law, literature, philosophy, films, psychology, and even science and medicine. When it comes to rape, we can hardly fathom what women are up against. When a woman states she did not want it, she goes against a real-world male belief, a belief that is so strong it is entrenched in nearly all facets of society. Men believe that a woman's true sexual nature is documented in pornography, a place where women never say no, which is then understood as a universal truth amongst men. Male supremacy is dizzying and it is unrelenting. Women are never entitled to not want sex. No authentic idea of bodily autonomy is ever given to her. Force does not violate, because force is what she sexually really wants. It doesn't victimize her, it actualizes her. The word porn from ancient Greece is literally translated to prostitute and is synonymous with lowliness, while graphos means to write. It is what remains today, a graphic depiction of the lowest of prostitutes. Dworkin writes that the prostitute or whore is incomprehensible unless one is immersed in the lexicon of male domination. This is why terms like sex work or sex worker are problematic. They obscure the fact that the shame associated with the word prostitute stems not from the woman herself, but from the male supremacist society that exploits and dehumanizes women this way. The force used in porn is real. Pornography is not acted sex, it is sex. The violence in porn is not simulated, it is real violence. The misogynistic slurs used in porn are real misogynistic slurs that impact all women. Men come to pornography believers and they leave missionaries, meaning that pornography transforms men, initially seeking pleasure, but ultimately reinforcing their belief in the superiority of male dominance and spreading this ideology to others. Pornography doesn't just offer men temporary pleasure, it shapes their worldview. Initially, men may encounter pornography as seekers of sexual satisfaction, but over time, they are indoctrinated into a system of belief that uphold male dominance and the objectification of women. By engaging with pornography, they become missionaries, actively promoting and spreading the belief that women exist for male pleasure, and that violence or subjugation is not only acceptable but desirable. In this way, pornography doesn't simply reflect society's existing gendered power dynamics, it reinforces and propagates them, deepening men's investment in patriarchal structures. In patriarchy, wanting a woman means wanting pornography. Being a woman means being pornography. As porn not only depicts women, it defines who we are in relation to male supremacy. Women are pressured to mold themselves into these gendered expectations or risk rejection, invisibility, or violence. As women, we have to actively fight back against what male supremacy tells us we are. The sexual colonization of women's bodies by men is a material reality. Men control the sexual and reproductive rights of all women's bodies. Nearly all institutions systematize physical aggression against women's bodies, including law, marriage, prostitution, healthcare, the economy, and organized religion, which leads to the reality that most women struggle for dignity and self-determination, which is exacerbated by race, class, age, disabilities, gender, and sexuality. In patriarchy, a prostitute can only be used, not raped. This is her true nature, to be simply her sexualized parts, especially her vagina, not vulva. Typically, every charge by women in prostitution or pornography that force was used to violate them is dismissed by positioning that female nature is fulfilled by the act of violation, which in turn transforms violation into an act that proves the victim's womanness. As we are taught, prostitutes choose this, which is explained to men as greed for money or pleasure or both. These specific women are money hungry and sexually ravenous pigs. The most bleak exploitation of women occurs on the left, where the word freedom is co-opted to capture the loyalties of women seeking liberation, only to have them transformed into collective free love objects used as will by left-wing men. On the right, however, the hatred of women is more overt. They are used without pretense or attempt to disguise the disdain with which they are treated. Men on both political spectrums are two sides of the same misogynistic coin. Leftists will state that porn is free sexuality, its liberation, without acknowledging that the sex trade industry is not sex but commerce. Freedom is the mass marketing of women as whore. Free sexuality for the woman is in being massively consumed, denied individual nature, denied any sexual sensibility other than that which serves the male. Capitalism is not wicked or cruel when the commodity is the whore. Profit is not wicked or cruel when the alienated worker is a female piece of meat. Corporate blood-sucking is not wicked or cruel when the corporations in question sell vaginas. Racism is not wicked when it is a black woman, Asian woman, Native woman, Hispanic woman, Middle Eastern woman, or Jewish woman who has her legs splayed for any man's pleasure. Poverty is not wicked or cruel when it is the poverty of the dispossessed women who have only themselves to sell. Violence by the powerful is not wicked or cruel when the tormented are women. Pornography is the graveyard of left-wing ideals. The left cannot have its prostitution or pornography and its politics too, because there is no way to fight racism and misogyny while jerking off to it at the same time. The United States is an imperial system that cannot maintain its racist system without women of colour being prostituted and having an underclass of people who have to sell their bodies. Race is sexualized within a racist system, and this is a prime purpose and consequence of pornography. When bigoted content is rewarded with an orgasm, there is very little to reason with. Women are despised for being in pornography, which possesses her body and proves that she should be hated. In porn, men are the imperial power that is cruel and arrogant, and they believe that conquering is a form of pleasure and that power itself is pleasure. We will know we are free when pornography no longer exists. As long as it does, we must see ourselves as the women who are used in it, used by the same male supremacy, subject to the same valuation and seen as vile as the women who beg for more. Men are betting on our compliance, ignorance, and fear. The boys hope that we would just think this is a norm, that it is normal to view gender this way. The boys are betting that we cannot face them and tell them that this is a violation of women's rights and targets the most vulnerable women, including trans women, women of colour, disabled women, poor women, and all other intersections. The boys are betting that we will believe that we are what they say we are. The boys are betting, and the boys are wrong.